Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Deadlines, same as they've been all along. So example 1, covering part 1, and quizzes part 2, covering part 2. Deadline defined on October 16th, Friday, end of the day, 4:59 to 9 p.m. Example 2, covering part 2, quizzes part 3, covering part 3, and deadline defined November 13th, end of the day. Example 3, example 4, quizzes part 4, deadline December 4th, also end of the day. And example 5, the exciting final, deadline is December 11th at noon. For the paper, deadlines are the draft November 16th if you want to do one, the +5 deadline November 18th, full credit deadline November 25th, and half credit deadline December 4th. For the final version of the paper, deadlines end of day, turn into Blackboard. For the draft, printed copy so I can mark it up. And that deadline for that is office hours, November 16th. Before pressing on to the new stuff, any stuff about the previous stuff or other stuff that needs more stuff? Okay. Again, on Monday, of course, we didn't have class because I was at the Leon County jury duty. And so I put up the videos for that. Before going on to the stuff after the videos, anything about the video stuff that needs any more stuff? It's all about the stuff. Okay, so we'll pick up after the exciting...
this class starts at 3:35, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because you started, it was just 3:35, no, I walked in.
Oh, I started early.
Oh, okay.
I jumped the gun. No, yeah, so you were late. I was starting early.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, extra value for your dollar. Okay, so religion and ethics. Now, one of the basic questions in ethics that moral theorists try to address is, what is the foundation, what is the basis of morality? So when we talk about things being good or evil, right or wrong, what serves as a foundation for that, if anything? Not surprisingly, many folks base their ethics, their morality, on religion. Now, there are, of course, many varieties of religion, and covering like everything from like way back to now would require way too much time. So we'll limit it to ethics and God. So basically we're assuming monotheism, but we should keep in mind that monotheism is not the only game in town, and that there are other views as well. Now, when it comes to ethics and God, and again, we're assuming, talking about monotheistic kind of consideration, there are numerous and various approaches to this. Numerous and various approaches to this connection between ethics and God. Now, one classic approach, and this is sort of looked at in terms of the extent to which God plays a role in moral theory, the theory that provides God with the most direct role is something we've seen before, our old friend, divine command theory. And the idea is very straightforward. On this view, what makes things good? Well, the answer is whatever God commands is good because God commands it. In terms of makes things evil, on this view, whatever God forbids is evil because he forbids it. To use a crappy analogy, it'd be kind of like parental command authority. The idea being that, what the parents say is right because they say so, because of the parents. What they say is wrong, forbidden is wrong because they say so. And we'll look at a bit at divine command theory. Now, interestingly enough, not everyone who's a monotheist who believes in God accepts divine command theory. Others accept what's called the Autonomy Thesis. The idea is this. Those who buy into the Autonomy Thesis believe in God. So if you ask them, does God exist? They'd say, but of course. But if you ask them about the connection between God and morality, they would reject divine command theory. So they would say that something being good is not just a matter of God saying it's good, and things being evil is just not a matter of God forbidding them, that morality has a degree of autonomy from God. And so good and evil is not a matter of just God saying so, it has an autonomous objective status. Now, for our divine command theory guy, we'll look at our good dead friend, John Duns Scotus. For our autonomy thesis guy, we'll look at our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, another approach put forth by our good dead friend Immanuel Kant is this. We'll see when you talk about Kant and deontology, you'll see more about the relation between God and ethics in his view. But Kant doesn't follow divine command theory, and he doesn't make God the basis of morality. But God still plays some important roles in his theory. One important role is this. He argues, intuitively, we want goodness and happiness connected. We want being good to result in happiness. Just like Aristotle and Confucius promise. Their essential sales pitch for morality is, if you are virtuous, you shall be happy. Now, as Kant points out, if you look at actual life, the good are not always happy. We don't see a necessary connection between virtue and happiness. And Kant thinks, well, that just isn't right. And so, in his theory, one of the roles that God plays is to ensure that there is that, ultimate justice. That the good are properly rewarded in the afterlife, and the wicked are punished. So Kant doesn't use God to define morality, but God still has an important role to play. And we'll see more of Kant later on. Now, as you might imagine, not everyone is a believer. There are people who are, of course, skeptical, and there are people who are straightforward atheists. And they put forth what is called secular ethics. Now, people have often raised the question, can there be ethics without God? And on one hand, the answer is obviously yes, because there are many moral theories that predate monotheism, and there are many moral theories that will come after monotheism that are still moral theories. What people are really asking is, can you have a working moral theory, one that's properly grounded without a religious basis? And the folks in secular ethics say yes. Now, there are some in secular ethics who can be like agnostic, or even somewhat religious, because they might believe that morality is separate from religion. More commonly, though, you would have people who don't believe in God, and so if there's going to be a foundation for morality, it can't be God, because God doesn't exist, so it has to be something else. Now, some secular ethicists are not like anti-religion, so they believe morality is based on, not on God, but they're not particularly hostile to God. There are, however, some secular ethicists who are vehemently opposed to religion, and they argue not only that there is no God, but they argue that morality based on religion is a inferior morality. And some go as far as to argue that religion grounded ethics is actually bad morality, that religion itself is immoral. And there are many famous atheists who, have the talk shows and publish books on this, and they take that view, that religion itself is an immoral threat. And so we have the full range, everything from God says so, so it's good, down to religious morality is a contradiction, that religion is fundamentally immoral. Now, since we're going through a lot of moral theories, we won't, hit all these different views, maybe the subject of, more detailed classes. So we'll just sort of stick with kind of the two big, approaches. One, the divine command theory. We'll also look at the autonomy thesis. Can you have morality separate from God in a way, but still of God? And then when we get to Kant, we'll talk about Kant. And we've seen secular ethics because we looked at Aquinas, Aristotle, and also Confucius. And we'll look at John Stuart Mill and others who don't bring God into their moral theory. Now, before getting to our sort of contest between divine command theory and the autonomy thesis, anything about the stuff so far that needs more stuff? Okay. Two important concepts from the Middle Ages. If we go back to the ancient days of the Middle Ages, when life was short, two views about God put forth with these: intellectualism and voluntarism. Now, you may think intellectualism means like, being intellectual, drinking lattes while talking about, poetry. And voluntarism might seem as someone who's like really voluntary. They help out, donate their time. But they mean different things. So what do they mean? Well, basically it goes down to the following dispute. One of the questions people who are religious debated about in the Middle Ages was the question of God's power. Specifically, it's accepted that God is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. But of course, omnipotent is just a word. So we need to define that. What are the extents of God's power? If you ever heard the classic, question, can God create a rock that he cannot lift? And that's supposed to be like a, kind of like a paradox. Because if he can't create the rock, then he's limited. But if he can create the rock, then he's also limited, because he can't lift it. And so people raise questions about the limits of God's power. Now, in general, there were two answers to this problem. One view is called voluntarism. That's the view that God's will is his primary attribute. That is, intellect is secondary. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that God's omnipotence amounts to the ability, the power to do anything, even the logically impossible. Even things that cannot be, he can make be. Even the things that cannot be done, he can do. Now this, by impossible here, I don't mean the usual thing where people say, the impossible takes a little longer, or, doing impossible things where they just mean really difficult. Impossible here means the literal meaning of the term, something that cannot occur, something that cannot be. Now, this would seem somewhat crazy, because it won't make any sense to us, but this would mean that God could create five-sided triangles. And by this I don't mean that we call, five-sided figures triangles. It's not that we call, pentagrams triangles. It's that triangles are three-sided figures that have five sides. How's that possible? It's not. But if God can do the impossible, he can make that happen. Or as another example, we accept that 2 plus 2 is 4 necessarily so. That 2 plus 2 is not 7. But God can make 2 plus 2 7. And again, it wouldn't be that we would just call 4 7. It would be 2 and 2 would be 7. How's that possible? It's not. So I cannot explain it. But God can make that happen. So people who are voluntarists believe that God is not limited by his intellect. He can do anything, even the impossible. So whatever he wills is. Now, one implication about this that leads to divine communal theory is the fact that God could make anything good. He could make genocide good. He could make murder good. Or he can make it bad. Our intellect cannot help us in this regard because it could be anything. So as you might imagine, those who accept voluntarism accept divine communal theory because whatever God wants, God gets. Now, as I mentioned, not everyone buys that, because this rests on the view that God can do anything, even the impossible. Now, the opposing camp is called intellectualism. That's the idea that God's will is constrained by his intellect, which means that God being all-powerful means that God can do anything that is possible, but he cannot do the impossible. Why? Well, because his intellect tells him that the impossible cannot be done. So God has, in this case, a limit on his power. He cannot do the impossible. So he can't make 2 plus 2 be 7. He can't make five-sided triangles because they cannot exist. He's constrained by logic. Now, and again, this is a debate about God's power, because for the intellectualist, being all-powerful means that God can do anything that can be done, but he can't do the impossible. But for some people, that's not enough. God has to be able to do anything that can be done, plus has to be able to do the impossible. Truly limitless power. Now, intellectualists will tend to accept the autonomy thesis because they believe that God commands what is good because it is good. It is not good because he commands it. So that's kind of the context of the debate over autonomy versus divine command theory. And this still goes on today. There's still the question whether God can do the impossible or not, and this ties into people's moral views as well. Okay, before pressing on to our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas, anything about the stuff so far that needs more stuff?
Can you explain Immanuel Kant again? You said it's autonomy?
Oh, yeah, Kant's view is this. He doesn't accept divine command theory, because he doesn't think that things are good because God says so. He also doesn't base his morality on God. So Kant's view, and we'll see more of this when we get to Kant, his view of the role of God, or at least one of his roles, is this. He claims that we have an intuitive belief that goodness should be connected with happiness. The good should be happy, the wicked should suffer. But of course, as we journey through life, we see the wicked exalted and happy and gleeful and triumphant, and we see the virtuous brought low in misery and torment and slain. And so that offends, according to Kant, our sense of justice. And so what we crave is true connection between goodness and happiness. We don't see it here, so what we need, at least according to Kant, to satisfy our thirst for justice is God's got to exist. There's got to be an afterlife in which the wicked are appropriately punished and the good are appropriately rewarded. But for Kant, boringly enough, it doesn't make God the foundation of morality. So, Kant's dead, but if you were to ask him, are things good because God says so? He'd say, well, no. Morality has an independence from God in that sense. So it's not a matter of just God says so, God forbids. So Kant would, fall under this. If you want to stick him on either voluntarism or intellectualism, he'd be under intellectualism. Does that help? Okay. Anything else? A little background for St. Thomas Aquinas. He was born in 1224, or perhaps 1225, into a noble Italian family. Now, he wrote a lot of stuff. He was a very prolific writer, cranked out lots of pages. In fact, it was said that he had several scribes with him, and he would be basically dictating all these books and writings to them. Now, interestingly, shortly before he died, he had a mystical experience that caused him to give up writing. And he said that the experience made him believe that all his writings were like straw, basically worthless. Which on one hand is kind of awful. Imagine spending your life doing something and then realizing, shortly before you die, that it's all been a waste, that it's all a crap. But I guess if you get a cool mystical experience, I guess that could be totally worth it. And so he just gave up writing. He just said he has seen things that make his writing appear to be straw. He just throws down his pen and never picks it up again. He ended up dying in 1274, and of course is still dead today. In 1323, he was canonized, which means he was shot out of a cannon. No, that part's a lie. He was made into a saint. And to be a saint, there's actually a procedure in the Catholic Church for sainthood. 1323, achieved sainthood. You got to have work confirm miracles. Probably one of the rather important conditions in case anybody's considering applying for sainthood is you got to be dead to be a saint. So kind of a hitch there. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII recommended his philosophy as a model for Catholic thought. So even though he's been dead a really long time, so he's not only dead, he's really dead, he's had a profound influence on Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular. And to sort of understand modern Christianity, and especially modern Catholicism, knowing about Thomas Aquinas, pretty useful stuff. He's a major contributor not only to Christian thought, but also to Western political and moral thought as well. So one of those really important dead guys. Now, like all great philosophers, he had a nickname, and his nickname was the Ox. Why? Well, because he was pretty large and rotund, but very gentle, like an ox. He was also called the dumb ox by his fellow students, because he was very quiet in class and did not engage in the heated discussions. Now, interestingly, morally enough, his fellow monks thought him a little slow. And so they decided to play, tease him and play a game on him. And one day, he was in the monastery, and one of the monks came running up to him and said, Thomas, Thomas, there's a cow flying over the monastery. And Thomas runs to the window to look. And of course, they all have a good laugh at him. But he turns to them and says, they say, Thomas, Thomas, don't you know that cows can fly? He turns to them and says, I would rather believe a cow could fly than a fellow Christian would lie to me. So, a master of the zinger, even at that early age. Now, as I mentioned, he wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote about 25 volumes before he realized that all his writing was worthless, and which is kind of sad. His greatest work, of course, is the Summa Theologica, which is longer than all of Aristotle's works. So he produced a lot of straw indeed. Now, we're obviously not going to read all 25 volumes of Aquinas. We'll look at a little slice from his ethical view. Now, one reason to place Aquinas after Aristotle is this. Aristotle laid out a well-accepted morality for, pre-Christianity. And it was, virtue theory, pretty, not the only moral theory, but well accepted, up until Christianity. Now, what sort of change do we see from the pagan virtue theory of Aristotle to Christian virtue theory? Well, our transition guy is our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. So it's not only philosophically interesting and theologically interesting, it's also historically interesting to see a transition in worldviews. Now, Aquinas basically begins with Aristotle. He takes Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which we looked at before, and to use a crappy analogy, think of the Nicomachean Ethics as like a layer cake. You get a cake. And what Aquinas does is basically adds on top of that pagan cake, he adds a Christian layer on top of it. So he doesn't, smash the Aristotle cake and knock it off the table. He leaves the Aristotle cake there, scrapes off a little of the pagan stuff, pulls those pieces off, but then puts a Christian layer on top. So it's basically Aristotle plus Christianity. Now, he agrees with Aristotle that all events have an end to which they're directed. So he is, just like Aristotle, believes in teleology. It's a purposeful universe. Now, obviously, one major difference is Aristotle did not believe in the monotheistic God. Aristotle, not a Christian. He predates Christianity by a long time. But if you were to ask Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, does the universe have a purpose? Is there an end? Is there a goal? Is there meaning? They both say yes. Yes, there is. Now, us, namely humans, we also have ends and inclinations. And one thing that makes us special is that, at least according to Aquinas, we are the only earthly beings that have the capacity to consciously choose to act towards ends and inclinations. So much like Aristotle, I believe that we're intelligent beings, and we have that freedom to choose to act towards whichever ends we select. So what's morality? Why is it separated from religion? Why not just roll it all under religion? Well, ethics for him deals with determining which ends are worthy of human pursuit, which things we should seek, and which things we should avoid. And the moral good, which he takes right from Aristotle, is fulfilling our natural ends as humans. So Thomas Aquinas would agree. As human beings, we have natural ends, goals and objectives. And goodness, here, secular goodness on earth, is fully being what we are, fully being human. Now, what about evil? Now, there's a classic problem in religion called the problem of evil, which works like this. It simply is a super simple version. If God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, how is there any evil? Being all good, he would not tolerate evil. Being all knowing, no evil can escape his sight. And being all powerful, no evil could exist. So there should be no evil. And so one thing that thinkers who believe that God is all powerful, good, and all knowing have to address is that problem. How to reconcile evil with God. Now, Aquinas buys into a well-established tradition, which is the idea that evil is a privation. It is a lack. It is an absence. It's not a thing. To use a crappy analogy, people have height, but do people have short? If someone's short, you say, wow, that person's got a whole bunch of short going on there. You might say it, but we think of short as an absence of height. You don't have short, you lack height. Likewise, to use the analogy, people don't have evil, they lack goodness. So goodness is a positive thing, and evil is a lack of goodness. So kind of one of the workarounds is that God doesn't create evil. Evil is like the holes in creation, the holes in the Swiss cheese. God makes the cheese, he doesn't make the holes. Now, of course, then clever people say, well, why is there any imperfection at all? Why isn't it all perfect? And of course, the standard answer to that is, God can't create a perfect world because the world would be perfect, then it would be God, but there can't be two gods, there can only be one, so the world has to be imperfect. But if you want to see some exciting adventures in theology and metaphysics, the modern philosophy class covers that. We'll look at discussions in our good dead friend Leibniz about why this is the best of all possible worlds, and how he handles the problem of evil. But for Aquinas, evil is a lack, absence of goodness. Now, like Aristotle, he bases ethics on the stuff we do. And one of the things that a moral theory has to do, as I mentioned, is it has to tell us which actions are morally significant and which are not. Now, normally, we tend to think that certain things are morally important and other stuff doesn't matter. For example, if someone's killing people, that morally matters. If someone is putting the toilet paper, with the paper on this side or over the top, we think that's not really morally relevant. We don't like, if you go into someone's bathroom and see their toilet paper is put differently, you don't go, evil person, must stop them. You might, but hopefully not. So we generally think that some things just aren't morally significant. Or like whether you wear your hat forward or back. But Aquinas believes, interestingly, wrongly enough, that every true action is either good or bad. There are no morally neutral true actions. Now, you may wonder, well, how could that be? How could everything have, moral goodness or badness? Because some things just seem totally insignificant. Well, Aquinas doesn't think that every action is equally significant, but he thinks all actions are good or evil. Why? Well, because he thinks that any action we choose either aims at something good or something bad. Has to ultimately point there. And so, whatever we do, if we choose to do it, we're either aiming at something good or something bad. Or so he claims. So nothing is morally, no chosen actions are morally neutral. So anything you choose to do is either going to be good or bad. It may be very insignificant, but it'll either be aimed at a good or a bad. I've been using the example of the toilet paper. People have very detailed, often weirdly, have detailed explanations about why they do it one way or the other. And usually it boils down to they think one way is better than the other. So they actually do aim towards the good in a weird way. So why is the chosen action so important? Well, for Aquinas, he's an intellectualist. Only chosen, deliberate actions are good or bad. So he thinks and this is what separates him from the voluntarist. He takes from the Greeks, like Aristotle, the view that we always will the good. That's what we always want. Then the question is, well, so why do we end up making, lots of bad choices? Well, the reason is not for Aristotle, or sorry, Aquinas, it's not a failure in our desire for the good, it's we get the good wrong. We think the wrong thing is good. Now, to use a crappy analogy, it's kind of like, well, think of like, moths. They're always drawn to the light. So they're always seeking, the light. But of course, sometimes that draws them into the bug zapper. So that's bad for, the moth. And so we're kind of the same way. We're always seeking the good, but sometimes we're mistaken what it is, and sometimes it's the moral equivalent of the bug zapper. So that's bad. Now, as you might imagine, not everyone buys the idea that we always will the good. There's an opposing view that people can will the good, the bad, or the ugly. So, but Aquinas buys in the traditional view, the Greek view, that we all will the good. That's what motivates us. We all want the good. We can screw up about what it is. We can be led astray by weakness and error and so forth. But that's a critical assumption. We seek the good. And so because of that, it's up to our intellect to keep us out of the moral bug zapper, to guide us towards what is truly good. So if you were to ask our good dead friend Aquinas, do people always seek the good? He would say yes. If you ask him, so why do people make such poor life choices? He would say that's a failure, well, one way it fails is of the intellect. They don't know what's good. And there are other ways to fail, which we'll see as well. Now, a good question might be to ask, so if everything chosen has moral significance, does that mean like everything I do has moral significance? And Aquinas says no. He distinguishes between human actions versus acts of humans, which sounds like something that would seem to be kind of like legalese, like something you might see in a lawsuit. But here's the distinction. A human action is something that is voluntarily, consciously willed and chosen because you are seeking a particular end. So, for example, to use a stupid example, if you take the toilet paper and you decide which way it goes on the holder, that's a conscious chosen action. Similarly, when you put on your hat and decide where your baseball hat, decide which way the bill's going to go, conscious chosen action. Obviously more extreme cases would be if you're running an auto company and you decide that your software should fake the emissions when it's being tested to bypass regulations, that would be a conscious choice as well, and far more serious than the toilet paper thing. So those actions are either good or bad, because we're choosing. Now, what about all the other stuff that happens? Well, acts of humans are behavior that's unconscious and involuntary. So, for example, sneezing. There are no good or evil sneezes. Well, unless you consciously choose to sneeze. But if you just sneeze, the beating of your heart, your pupils dilating, etc., all those things that are involuntary, that you don't have control over, that you don't choose, like a sudden reaction, like if you're startled, those would all be for Aquinas acts of humans. And they would lack moral significance because you're not choosing them. But his view basically is whatever you choose, it's either good or bad. Every choice, good or evil. Or so he claims. Now, how do we tell whether an action is good or bad? Suppose you want to go through life doing good, or alternatively want to be like really bad. So how do we tell? Well, very similar to Aristotle, he offers the following. The first thing to consider is the object of the action. What is the goal? And he uses the example of the giving of alms, basically donating to charity. And the object would be what you're trying to do. So in the giving of the money to charity, the object is to give money to charity. The second point of concern are the circumstances of the action. This would be such things as where the money came from, the needs of the person, the recipient, and other factors that set the context. Thirdly is the end. Now, this may seem similar to the object, but the object is basically what is the task aimed at. So giving to charity, the task is take, in this case, money and give it to the charity. But of course, the person's end might be one of many things. For example, a person may have as an end given to charity to help people in need. They're moved by a spirit of generosity. Or it might be to get the tax break. They're moved by a spirit of getting breaks on taxes. Or it may be to look good in front of other people. They're moved by the spirit of increasing their status. Or it may be to help out in their upcoming, campaign. Or to offset like a negative thing they did to make them look better. And so those would be the three factors. What is the object? What are the circumstances? And what is the person's end? What are they trying to achieve? Before pressing on, the last bit here, anything about the bits so far that needs more bits and stuff? Which I think is a new snack food, bits and stuff, like kibbles and bits, only for humans. Or humans and dogs. They're not picky, they'll eat our stuff. True. Now, as I mentioned, Aristotle, pagan, dead pagan, very dead pagan. And of course Aquinas, dead Christian saint. And so obviously what he did is he had to modify the pagan, ethics of Aristotle and put it in that Christian layer on top. So what is the difference between Aristotle's, earthly ethics and what Aquinas added? Well, here's the difference. First, one difference, as I mentioned, is that although Aristotle accepts that we're special, we're rational animals, God has no role in his theory because he predates monotheism, by quite a bit, Christianity by, a lot more. So there's not Christianity in Aristotle. Interestingly, worldly enough, though, if you take the class on medieval philosophy, many Christian thinkers put forth the claim that Aristotle and Plato were Christians before Christ. That's kind of their bumper sticker slogan. And some made that argument, and other people think that that's really not true. But only history knows for sure. Now, Aquinas thinks that Aristotle definitely did a pretty good moral theory. But going back to the cake analogy, the Aristotle cake is cake that you eat on earth, so to speak. It's earthly cake. It's for life here and now. So if you were to ask Aquinas, is Aristotle's ethics good for the life on earth? Aquinas would say, yeah. It aims at building as much happiness as possible by imperfect beings on the imperfect earth. But there's that second layer to the cake, the spiritual layer. And what Aquinas claims is this. He claims, in our heart of hearts, we long not just for happiness, not just for temporal, terrestrial good. We long, we desire, we crave perfect good. The most perfect good of all. Now, since Aquinas believes the world is imperfect, we can't find the perfect good here. So, where is the supreme good? Well, his answer is this. It's not to be found in nature, because nature does not provide us with the perfection we need to satisfy our desire or our need for spiritual goodness. So, the only possible source is God. So he claims. Now, there's a catch. There's always a catch, but here's the catch. You achieve the supreme good, the supreme happiness, not by having intellectual knowledge of God. So even though Aquinas believes you can know that God exists here on earth, in fact, he gives his classic 5 ways: motion, probability, necessity, design, etc. But he thinks that merely knowing that God exists is not enough. You can't achieve perfect happiness that way. What you have to do is hang out with God. You have to have the acquaintance of God. And of course, to do that, you've got to be dead. That's the catch. So, to achieve perfect happiness requires being in God's presence, and that requires being dead. Now, interestingly, abhorrently enough, Aquinas takes this as an argument for immortality. How so? Well, he agrees with Aristotle that we do not have desires that would be impossible to achieve, general ones. Now, he doesn't mean that if you really, really, really want to be a Hollywood superstar that you'll achieve it, sadly. He doesn't mean that if you really, 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 really want a Maserati, that you'll get one. What he means is that our natural desires are achievable in the world. You know, like having family, friendship, happiness, etc. Those are achievable. And so, Aquinas tags onto it our alleged desire for perfect, supreme happiness. We can't achieve it here, but he claims that sort of goal must be achievable. So the only way we can achieve it is if we are immortal, that after our bodies die, we go to heaven, we hang out with God, and so he takes that as proof for immortality. We've got to be immortal because we really want to be supremely happy. We can't do it here. You can only do it with God. You can only hang out with God when you're dead. So you've got to have immortality of the soul. So when your body dies, your soul goes to heaven if you're good, and you're hanging out with God, and you're supremely happy. Except for with people who are supremely bad, and they get to hang out with the red guy. That's that. Okay, before pressing on to more Aquinas, what do you think about the stuff so far? Or the red guy that needs more stuff? Now, Aquinas lays out what can be considered a natural morality. And this basically is stuff he takes from Aristotle. Now, he doesn't steal it from Aristotle because he gives credit to Aristotle, so he's kind of borrowing. Now, a good question is, we saw this all in Aristotle, how do we know what we should be doing? And Aristotle's answer is, we reflect on human nature, we realize there are rational beings, we act rational, that's virtuous, we become happy, then we die. For Aquinas, he changed a little bit. He believes that God created us to live a certain way, that there is a way that we should be. So he believes in a natural order. Going back to our argument in part one, the natural argument, Aquinas lays down a foundation for that. He accepts that God created us a particular way, and there's a way we should be. And to not be that, or go against it, would be wrong. To follow it would be right. Now, the question is then, how do we know what that is? How do we know what it is we should be? Well, his claim is this. Since God built us a certain way, we literally were born that way, by reflecting on human nature, according to Aquinas, we can realize what we should be. Because what we are tells us what we should and should not be, or so he claims. So we can go from an is to an ought. Now, he believes that human nature is the same across all cultures and all times. So the rules of the natural law are universal. So he's not a relativist. He believes that if you go back to the first humans, the same natural law applies. You go to people in ancient Greece, same deal. Medieval Europe, same deal. 1930s America, same deal. Mars colony, 2075, same deal. Elvis Centauri colony, 3025, same deal. So things humans, as long as they're humans, will have the same basic, way to live, or so he claims. Now, not everyone buys that. There are folks that don't believe in any human nature. Clearly, there are those who believe there may be a human nature, but it can be altered. And there are people who believe there's a human nature and believe it can be altered, and that scares them a whole bunch, and they don't want people messing with that. which takes us back to the natural argument. There are people who don't want people tampering with people to create, awful things. So how do we know what this nature is? Well, basically it's following Aristotle. What is good is in accord with reason, and this is acting in accord with the natural law. And if we reflect on human nature, natural inclinations, we can infer moral principles. So what we do is basically reflect on what is it to be human, what is it we are, and that will tell us how we should be. Again, if you're, depending on what sort of topic you pick for your paper, if you use the natural argument, this could be a useful way to argue. For example, if you haven't got a topic yet, here's one that may be interesting. One thing that people have long, speculated about in science fiction is modifying human beings, to make us better, faster, stronger, different. If you've ever seen, the Captain America movie, that's basically modification, making the perfect soldier. And of course, science fiction is full of that, modifying people genetically so we can, be stronger, so we can survive in different environments, maybe have gills, maybe the ability to see, in the dark, maybe the ability to engage in photosynthesis, the ability to survive, harsher radiation, lack of water, etc. And so one interesting question is, should we modify what it is to be human, engage in genetic modification? One way to argue against that would be to tap into Aquinas. The idea being that God has created us a certain way, being what we should be is remain within that human nature, and you can argue from that that modifying that, changing that, would be wrong. And the trick, of course, is laying out exactly why that would be wrong. Now, of course, you could also argue that changing our nature could be part of our nature, modifying us to be different. Now, continuing with natural morality, how would we sort of figure out what we should be doing? Well, here's how he kind of works it out. What we would do essentially is what we consider today empirical science. We would look at how creatures behave and try to infer from that the moral underlying principles that God put into play. So to use a crappy analogy, it's like we're watching like a game, and we're trying to figure out the rules. But instead we're looking at like how people act. We're trying to figure out what are the moral rules that God laid down. For example, a good question is, why should we consider killing and suicide wrong? Well, his answer is this. If you try to kill something, living creature, what does it try to do?
Get away.
It either tries to get away and survive, or it tries to kill you right back. And that's the only polite thing to do. I mean, the polite response to something tries to kill you is politely try to kill them right back. That's just decency. It's just good manners. It's true. Now, so if we reflect on that, we can see that creatures try to avoid death. All creatures do this. So we can infer, according to Aquinas, that we should not kill and we should not commit suicide. Roughly put, creatures don't like that, so we shouldn't be doing that to them. Now, another example, all animals, he claims, seek to protect their young and preserve their species, which is generally, true. And they do in different ways, but all creatures try to protect their young and preserve their species. And so he thinks what follows from this is that we should, as human beings, protect our young, preserve our species. Now, we are, of course, more than just, he sees us as being more than just the animals. And we have rationality, which things like most other animals lack. And so he thinks that as human beings, we have other behavior as well. For example, we seek truth, we live in social groups, and so he thinks that what we need to do to fulfill that is follow the rules needed to live in society. So following social laws, he claims, is natural to us. Now, as a final point, one thing you'll note if you travel the worlds and the seven seas that people disagree about morality. So how then, if the moral law is supposed to be universal, it's supposed to be self-evident and natural, why is there any disagreement about morality? And why are people behaving badly? Well, his answer is this: that people do so because they're blinded by passion, because of bad habits, and perhaps ignorance. Basically, defects and limitations. People just don't know. To use a crappy analogy, and we'll pick up here next time, it's kind of like with diet. Everyone wants to have like a good diet. Why doesn't everyone have like a good diet? Well, sometimes they don't know. People don't know what's good to eat. And sometimes people fall prey to the fact that Twinkies taste so delicious. And on that thought, on Twinkies, we shall end. The next time we'll pick up with more Aquinas.